Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the COP26 official side event, Building Capacity and Tracking Climate Action to Empower Women and Girls. I'm Mairi Dupar. I'm with the ODI and Climate and Development Knowledge Network, CDKN, where I work as the Gender and Social Inclusion Lead. On today's agenda, after this short introduction, you will hear a welcome from Dr. Shehnaaz Moosa, the CDKN Director, who is based at our headquarters in Cape Town, South Africa, and she has pre-recorded a message specially for you. CDKN is a knowledge program all about getting knowledge into action to empower and improve the lives of the most climate vulnerable. Today at COP26, we are launching 2 new publications. I'm delighted to tell you we'll be launching Advancing Gender Equality and Climate Action, a practical guide to setting targets and monitoring progress, which we are publishing together with ODI, SNV, CARE and Mercy Corps. And secondly, Strengthening Gender Integration in Climate Finance Projects by CDKN and WIDO. This will be followed by an interactive panel discussion about how to get gender mainstreaming off paper and into action in climate programs. And then it's your chance to ask questions of our panelists. We'll have some concluding remarks by Santiago Alba of IDRC, our partner. First, I'm going to say a few words about the first publication that we're launching today, Advancing Gender Equality in Climate Action, a practical guide to setting targets and monitoring progress. And there are a few copies at the front, so if you really would like a hard copy and you can't manage with digital, do come and see us afterwards. I was the primary author together with Patricia Velasco, and Patricia is very sorry she can't be here today to co-present. So I'm going to go ahead and outline the manual for both of us. The target audience of this guide is really climate and development practitioners. It was developed in response to the need for resources to explain how to apply gender integration principles. There are no shortage of excellent gender mainstreaming principles for climate projects and programs which have been developed over the years, many of them by United Nations agencies and NGOs and others. However, when CDKN has worked with partners at country and district and city level, we have heard again and again, "Isn't gender important? I think I ought to do something about it. I don't know where to start." So what we did is we partnered with the organizations that you see represented here today, and I will introduce them all as it comes time for the interactive panel. It's SNV and CARE and Mercy Corps, and also a program called Prosper that was implemented in Malawi. And we worked with them to capture learning from their field experiences in setting appropriate gender targets and developing indicators and monitoring, evaluating and learning systems, and documenting that learning and all the insights that the project managers had. And the project managers co-authored the individual case study chapters and gave us access to internal documentation to understand how some of that adaptive management and learning happened in projects. As the managers, the teams, they tried out different modes of gender targeting, and not just for women and girls, but also other groups in society who had particular capacities and talents to bring to climate solutions, but hadn't been fully included yet. We started off actually thinking that we would write what we were calling a MEL manual, a monitoring, evaluation and learning manual. But then we realized that it couldn't make sense to produce such a guide alone. MEL needs to be embedded, it needs to be integrated into an overall climate project design and planning process, which has got adequate gender analysis and gender goals and practices threaded all the way through it. So that's why we have an introduction and several framing chapters in the guide, which talk about understanding people's needs, assessing gender responsive solutions and planning, and monitoring, evaluating and learning concepts. But much of this material is pointing, it's signposting to the great resources that are already out there. And then we dive really deeply and in the kind of detail that practitioners want and need into our 5 case studies, which I'll introduce in a moment. You see some icons on the left-hand side of the slide there, and that explains how the publication is organized. It has top tips for assessing women's specific needs. It has knowledge builder sections. Those are the signposts to other recommended resources. It has mini case studies from CDKN's experience, short summaries about gender integration in climate projects with references to case studies that we've already published. And then it has these new and very detailed case studies with tabular formats, lots of information on indicators and assumptions behind theories of change and how those were tested in the field, and those are laid out in this way for the first time. So what the case studies really do is unpack how these different organizations have developed those gender responsive objectives and targets appropriate to different sectors and contexts, different country contexts, and created relevant indicators and MEL systems to track and understand progress against them, and how they've managed their projects adaptively in response. And now I'll give you a peek at the case studies. I'll start from the upper left in Latin America. We've got a case study from CARE in Ecuador called Enabling Andean Communities to Adapt to Climate Change through the Management, Conservation and Restoration of the Paramos ecosystem, which is a very unique, a special ecosystem in the uplands. And the overall thrust of this project was to reduce communities' vulnerability to climate change by establishing a resilient model of family income generation, while contributing to at the same time to the conservation of the Andean Paramos ecosystem, which provides water for human consumption and for irrigation. And just there's so much richness in the case studies. I couldn't possibly present all of them now, so I've just plucked an interesting indicator from each one to give you a taste of what's in the guide. And one of the interesting indicators that this project used was the number or percentage of women who are active users of financial services developed by the project in the context of conservation agriculture and also Paramos and forest ecosystem protection. Then we have a study from Tanzania, the Energizing Development, or NDEV program, which involves the energy sector. So it has low carbon development objectives. It really has aimed to tackle energy poverty in the country, increase access to cleaner energy sources for households, and increase the amount of sustainable income for women and men. And one of their key indicators was around the percentage of trained cook stove producers. That's improved Matawi cook stoves, which have lower emissions and burn very cleanly. So that what percentage of producers of these cook stoves are women, and you will be familiar with many cook stoves projects which look at uptake on the consumption side, but what's particularly interesting about this one is that they were tracking how many women are managing to generate income by actually crafting and selling the cook stoves themselves. Next, Cambodia. The Cambodia Horticulture Advancing Income and Nutrition Program chain has been all about climate change adaptation. It's a project of the Swiss Development Corporation implemented by SNV. And its objective overall is to support poor smallholder farmers to increase their productivity and income and to thus improve food security and nutrition as well as climate resilience. So they're really looking to integrate climate objectives and gender objectives in what is a sort of value chain strengthening project in the Cambodian horticulture context. And one of their key indicators is the number of homestead farmers that increase income by an average of $100 equivalent per year. And of 5,000 homestead farmers, 95% should be female, according to their targets. And of the 1,000 commercial farmers they were targeting, half should be female. The next case study is from Malawi. It's the Promoting Sustainable Partnerships for Empowered Resilience, or PROSPER, which is part of the Building Resilience and Adapting to Climate Change, or BRAC programme, funded by the UK government in Malawi until recently. And PROSPER has aimed to build the resilience of households and communities across many diverse activities, I must say. But one of the key indicators that they set and have measured is around shock absorption and measuring the number of women and men with a minimum savings of the equivalent of around $19 US per village savings and loan cycle. And then last but absolutely not least, from Nigeria, the really interesting project called Engine, Educating Nigerian Girls in New Enterprises, which is actually, it's not foremost a climate project, it's an entrepreneurship and professional services development project. But we decided to include it in the guide because it has so many really good aspects of what we call intersectionality, looking at different subgroups of adolescent girls and how you can really support them to get on a sustainable career path. And it is working in some very climate-affected dryland areas of Nigeria. So it's looking to support and help in-school girls to successfully transition to the next phase of education or complete their current educational cycle and enter the workforce, and give girls whose schooling has been interrupted for various reasons the opportunity to build functional literacy and numeracy while building their assets and diversifying income sources. So one of their key indicators was the percentage of eligible out-of-school girls supported by the project to re-enter formal education. And what we will do later is turn to the speakers to unpick some of the more detailed lessons coming out of those case studies. Now I'm going to turn to my next two speakers, who are Tara Daniel, welcome Tara, a senior program officer at the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and Tete Laurent from the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung. And they have, well, Tara in particular, I should say, have been responsible for this rather amazing publication, which is also launched this week at COP26, which is very much a sister publication to the first one I just described, because this is looking at experiences from climate finance projects from the big climate funds, as opposed to the NGO-based programs and projects, which I just described in the first publication. So without further ado, Tara, I'll hand over to you. Please, yourself and Tete, tell us more about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marie. I agree, there's an incredible complementarity between these two publications. And so I'm really glad to have the opportunity to present the framework that we developed with this one. When I had the chance to work on this project, I had the opportunity to speak with gender experts and others engaged in the project cycle of climate finance projects, really drawing from their collective experience across dozens and possibly hundreds of projects. And I took what I was hearing forward in additional interviews to really test assumptions, to more deeply understand the shared challenges and opportunities. And this publication represents what I heard with complementary project examples to dive into some of these details and how they're operationalized. These 6 recommendations, they're points of inflection. They're these moments where there are opportunities to strengthen gender integration, to really take a project to the next level. Unfortunately, often these are moments where the opposite choice is being made. In this report, we do really address the barriers and the complexities to implementing these recommendations, because we hope that by surfacing them, that the implementing entities, the project teams that are grappling with this question of how best to integrate gender across their project are therefore going to be able to plan with more intentionality and with more direct resources to better address the challenges and to navigate these complexities. So what I was hearing first and foremost is the importance of leading with local gender expertise, recognizing that for our project to truly aspire to advancing gender equality, there must be an understanding of the local community, including language, customs, and gender dynamics. And understanding is really complemented by participation, partnering with grassroots organizations, and women and gender-related groups in both design and implementation. This allows you to leverage existing knowledge and data and resources at all levels, including with the national gender machinery. And in this report, one thing we do is also tease out what these various types of gender expertise can and should look like. This is important because a project should start off with qualitative and quantitative data, with gender analyses that can provide a baseline of information, not only about the number of males and females participating in some stakeholder meeting, but really about gendered access to resources, time and labor allocation, status and adherence to laws and policies that promote or detract from gender equality. We also really turned to the project team, recognizing how much a project team and how it's constituted influences a project. When gender consultants are brought on with different, often shorter, timeframes, when there are a dozen ways of signaling that their expertise is not as valued as other team members, then gender equality concepts and practices are less likely to be integrated fully throughout a project. When there's a lack of continuity and a gap between the person and the team that has invested into the design of a gender action plan or other gender documentation for the project, and those that are really taking forward those ideas and implementation, we also see a failure to fully realize the potential of the project. And ultimately, we recognize that part of this valuing of gender expertise is ensuring that the entire team can really appreciate and understand what the various gender experts, whether they are local individual experts or local grassroots organizations that have been brought in, are really bringing to the table so that that can be appreciated. These enabling factors are things that we also wanted to highlight for implementing entities and project teams to recognize that can influence whether or not they're able to fully build on these recommendations and take advantage of these key moments within the project cycle. And ultimately, we also wanted to say a few things, or rather the people that I was interviewing and who were so gracious with their time wanted to say a few things to the climate funds about how their work can better be supported as gender experts, and really recognizing the role of these individual gender experts in contributing to the integration of gender across these incredibly large portfolios of climate finance projects. So with that, I will turn to my colleague Tet for a few comments.
Yes. Thanks very much, Tara. And my name is Tetet, and I work with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And our overall advocacy is that of advancing gender-responsive climate finance. So I'm really happy about this report because it offers us a rooted guidance on how gender-responsive climate finance can be achieved, not just as a box-ticking exercise, for the sake of compliance, where experts are flown into the community and empower the women and the communities. So that kind of approach, unfortunately, is still very much around. And that's why we're quite happy that there are now some headways into trying to transform all of these dynamics now regarding mainstreaming or integrating gender into climate finance projects. But what we would really like to see on the ground is not only addressing climate change or climate impacts, but also reduces gender inequalities and that which empowers women. It should involve more women on the ground, and how can actions respond accordingly? Let's make it more concrete. For instance, there are so many renewable energy projects, because it's the way to go, 100% renewable. But do these renewable energy projects actually not only provide electricity, but also try to, lower or decrease women's burden in caring for their families and housework? So those things are very, very important so that we can say that this gender integration is also transforming, the way social relations, especially in the family, in the community, are also set up. So what we're saying is the climate funds need to have social and gender experts and not just technical ones. Yeah, we need to look at the social and human rights dimensions of all of these climate finance projects, and the funds should be made directly accessible to women's groups working not just on specific, small community-based initiatives, but also those trying to interrogate the structural issues affecting, gender inequality, women's poverty, landlessness, joblessness, etc. So thanks very much. We like that guide.
Thank you so much, Tetet. Now we're going to go to the video from Dr. Shehnaaz Moosa, who will give you another bolt of energy, I am sure, about why gender equality and women's empowerment does matter in climate projects. So technical team, to Dr. Shehnaaz, please.
Greetings and thank you for taking the time to join our event today. I am Shehnaaz Moosa, Director of the CDKN, the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. We are a partnership between 4 organizations, and we're based across the globe in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the United Kingdom. We support decision makers in designing and delivering climate-compatible development, and we do this by tailoring knowledge in support of locally owned and managed policy processes. We work in partnership with decision makers in the public, private, and non-governmental sectors locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. Integrating gender and social inclusion into climate action is one of CDKN's key themes, along with climate finance. We strongly encourage intersectional approaches to gender and social inclusion. This means not only looking at the capacities and talents of women and men, girls and boys, and their vulnerabilities in the face of climate change and vis-a-vis climate action, we also look at age, ethnicity, ability or disability, and other characteristics that affect people's status in society and their abilities to be change makers. Zooming in on gender just for a minute, why should we care about gender in climate action? Let's take a step back and consider a few statistics. On measures of human development, we know that women and girls are not currently able to access basic development services and meet their basic development needs as well as men and boys. So women are already behind. For example, at a global level, women are more than 5% behind men on achieving these basic indicators of development. In South Asia, women are 17.6% behind men's attainment. I mean, let's just think about that for a bit. We know that climate change will undermine development progress in the future and is already doing so. We also know that women and girls are more affected by climate change than men and boys. Climate-compatible development is needed to deal with the impacts of climate change now and into the future, and to limit further climate change. The development part of climate-compatible development needs to be gender smart in order to achieve equality. The climate-compatible part needs to be gender smart to prevent women from slipping even further behind in having their needs met. What is more, climate interventions are more effective and have better outcomes if they involve and target women and harness women's potential. One of CDKN's goals has been to document actual examples in communities of how empowering women and girls in one, assessing climate risk, and two, decision-making and management of climate intervention makes a material difference in the effectiveness of programs. There are, and they'll go into it later in the event, certain key references on why gender matters in climate projects. Today, we are going to be sharing with you new CDKN publications that provide practical guidance on how to integrate gender and social inclusion concerns effectively in climate projects and programs to ensure they are as relevant and successful as possible. With this, I wish you a good event and hand you back to my colleague, Mairi Dupar, who is physically in Glasgow.
That was Shehnaaz speaking from Cape Town. Thank you, Shehnaaz. Now we're going to have some interaction with the panelists. I'd like very much to introduce Martin Veen, who is just to the right of Tetet there. He is Head of Global Energy for SNV. And then to his right is Robbie Reda, who is lead for CDKN in Ethiopia and also director of SouthSouthNorth, the same NGO as Shehnaaz, an NGO. And then to his right is Lizzie Whitehead, who is a climate advocate at Mercy Corps. And we'll come to my colleague and friend Santiago Alba at the end for closing remarks. That's Santiago at the end. So if we start with you, Martin. Now, in the newly launched publication, Advancing Gender Equality in Climate Action, which is co-branded with SNV, there are two in-depth case studies from SNV projects from completely different sectors. There's one from your sector, energy, which is about the improved cook stoves, and there's also the one about horticultural value chains and how to bring climate risk management and gender into there. So let's maybe start with the agricultural example. The SNV Cambodia team were looking at the potential, as I said, to mainstream both gender and climate risk management as cross-cutting themes in their project. How did they go about it?
Thanks for, first of all, for the opportunity to be here. And on behalf of SNV as well, thanks for the opportunity provided to showcase some of the work with some practical examples. And before I respond to your question, just a brief reflection. We're having a session on gender inclusion and equality. And if you look at, just have a look around in the room. When we talk about gender, the balance between female and men, in the room, I see a dominance of women. And I just want to mention the topic of gender and gender equality is for all of us. It's women and men. The presentations today were done by very respected colleagues, women. We have men on the right side reflecting. I just want to make the case that the publication, fortunately, was written by women and men. And indeed with female and male colleagues from S&V contributing. So we see that reflected in the publication. I think that's very important. I hope for the next COP, we will have women and men presenting and we have a balanced room as well. I think it's important. That to start off with. I think I'm saying that, also reflecting on your comment at the beginning, we need gender expertise on board on projects. Yes, it's a specialism. At the same time, it needs to be in all of our heads. I want to have teams, preferably without a gender expert, honestly, but that have it embedded in their work. Because it's not something on the side, it's something that is a structural element of what we should be doing. And why? It's well described in the publication, but gender inequality is a reality in all the countries where we work, and not just for NGOs. This is now a publication done by NGOs. We work a lot with businesses, with financial institutions. They operate in that same reality, in a reality where there's unequal opportunities for women and men, unequal access to resources, inequalities in decision-making process and power. If you design a project or a business case or a financial intervention without knowing and realizing that, you have a false start. Cambodia, indeed, realizing that, at the beginning of the project did a gender assessment. And there's things coming out that I would not have known as an outsider. Indeed, a dominance of women in agricultural production. The men generally working in the urban centers, with all the consequences of that. Women not only being responsible for agricultural production, but of course also for everything that happens at the household level. Now, how do you then define an intervention strategy if you want to build capacities of farmers to increase their production, their income, and improve their nutrition? First of all, you realize women there actually have very limited time. They're way too busy. And they cannot go far away from where they live. So you need to adjust how you do your training, how you do your coaching, where you organize that, and how you structure your training and coaching programs. Things like that. There is a lot more in the publication. I would say really recommended reading. But those are elements I just want to highlight. If you are not aware, if we are not aware of those, say, contextual backgrounds to inform our interventions, we might really start wrongly with our interventions. And again, all of us.
Thank you. I was going to ask as a follow-up question, but you might have already answered it, Martin. What are some key learnings from that chain project in Cambodia to sort of spill over into other SNV projects? You've already said, really understand the context, do a good gender assessment from the beginning. Any other sort of headline implications from the Cambodia experience?
Actually, I connected on that with the Cambodia team because obviously I'm also looking at it from a distance. And again, I'm working in the energy sector mostly. But what is coming out is, for example, with the capacity building that was done to government officials, to NGO representatives, but also to women groups and different stakeholders there, that at the end of the day, indeed, there was an impact in terms of income increase, production increase, and also with strong participation of women in those processes. An important learning for me was that actually during project implementation, they needed to adapt. For example, at the beginning, there was a strong focus on improved seeds because it was really a need identified with the farmer groups. Along the way, it started to focus more on irrigation, for example, water management and drip irrigation. Now, an interesting effect of that is if you have technologies like that and capacity building on that being implemented, it actually, for women, provides an opportunity to reduce their workloads, for example. They're actually doing the job on the farm. If you have a drip irrigation system that actually allows you to increase your production and your income, while it reduces your workload, you can actually spend that time in different ways. And it's because then women particularly having a strong impact there, it also changes the power dynamics within families. If you have an increase in production and income, you have better chances actually to influence also decision-making processes within the family. Those were some of the learnings I've seen coming out, which I thought were particularly interesting. And again, there's way more in the actual publication.
Please read it. Thank you. Well, that in fact is a perfect segue to the NDEV program in Tanzania, because when we were writing that up, I noticed that the project did all kinds of innovative things with bringing husbands and wives together to talk about business models and the women's role in the business of producing cook stoves and marketing them. And it obviously was changing gender dynamics in the household as well as in the community. Any more reflections then on the cook stoves project?
On the cook stoves project, I know quite well because I've been working and living in Tanzania for 5 years, actually when the project started. And I still keep an eye, of course, on things as well. As you already said, clean cooking generally has a strong gender element, but on the end user side, that's already embedded there, that's great. And to improve then the living conditions with particularly impact on women and children. But we want to go beyond that. And basically, this is about local producers of cook stoves that actually produce a quality of cook stoves that outperforms also many of the industrial stoves. And also don't underestimate the quality and the energy efficiency of those stoves at a low cost, locally produced. And many of those, when we start to scope who would be in a position to kind of start doing that at village level, particularly what was done is to look at people that are currently working with clay, ceramics, and metal cladding. Because those are the basic ingredients that you know that you need to produce those stoves. And typically what we saw is a lot of women engaging. Obviously maybe because there's a tradition and culture of women particularly involved in ceramics. Now the interesting thing coming out is that generally quality of stoves is better in women-led enterprises. Yeah? Marketing and sales is more effective if it's led by women enterprises. Why? Because they understand how cook stoves work, they understand the needs that it responds to, that it can replace firewood, that it will reduce smoke in the house. They know the implications on cooking and nutrition. I mean, believe me, they can do a better sales pitch to their fellow women on marketplaces than men can do. So their sales figures were typically also higher. So you have all kinds of interesting dynamics there, but you still deal with the same inequalities in power dynamics. So on the decision-making level, for example, what happened there, interesting. Normally the decision-making is more with the men, but when they started to see that those businesses growing and then also infrastructure being added, the men became proud because this is also within the village, this is their family. Look at us, what we're establishing, look at my wife. And actually we had cases where the men became kind of, you know, an employee or doing parts in the business which was actually led by the women. So that whole, there was actually a transformation and also in power dynamics within those families and in decision-making levels within those families. So quite interesting results by really focusing not on the end user side, but actually using at women empowerment at the enterprise level, and with that changing power dynamics. Yeah.
Thank you, Martin. Well, it's fascinating, and we could go on, but let's see what the audience has to ask you at the end. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Lizzie, whose organisation Mercy Corps also has a case study in the manual about educating Nigerian girls in new enterprises, or ENGIN. Now, this project ran for about 8 years and recently concluded its second phase, which took place in 4 Nigerian states, I believe. Is that correct? The Federal Capital Territory, Abuja, Lagos, and also the dryland northern states of Kano and Kaduna. And it was, as I said before, first and foremost a programme for improving the life prospects of adolescent girls, but it certainly has a lot to teach climate projects and programmes, and it was in a very climate-affected area. Maybe first, Lizzie, tell us about what ENGIN's mission and goals were, and why the programme chose to target different groups of adolescent girls in the communities.
Sure, thanks, Mairi, and thanks for including our case study in the book. So it's sad to report that in Nigeria, they rank 139 out of 156 on the Global Gender Gap Index. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot as to some of the barriers that people will be facing, especially women in that country. The program reached 18,000 young women and adolescents, and it targeted 2 different age groups within that, and it tried to treat various subgroups within young women and adolescent girls differently. So some of our fellow panelists earlier talked about intersectionality and the need to understand context. So we actually tried to understand what was it exactly that was making those young women vulnerable. And that could have been the fact that they were orphans, or they were already young mothers, or they had come from a particular conflict in the household. Maybe they'd been a victim of gender-based violence. So we tried to understand exactly what their situation was that made them vulnerable, and then try and adapt the program accordingly. And it was an economic empowerment program, but at Mercy Corps we believe that actually helping people get good income and jobs is actually a strong part of climate adaptation. And we wanted to try and find them economic opportunities that were also climate resilient. There's no point in giving them jobs in industries that won't exist in the next few years. So climate was mainstreamed into how we approach it, but it wasn't a climate program.
Thank you. So how did you design activities differently for the different groups of girls? And how was that ultimately connected to improved outcomes for the different groups?
Sure, so when we tried to understand what made them vulnerable, a few examples of that were that some of the participants had hearing impairments. So we actually changed the learning program to deliver that in sign language. And the aim was to try and keep young girls at school and try and keep them at school as long as possible. There's evidence that says for every year that they spend in school, their earning potential is 10% higher. So the more we can empower them by staying in school, getting better education, gives them better outcomes in life. We also worked with young mothers, and obviously it was hard for them to be in an educational setting, so we went to them. I think you're probably familiar with the term meet them where they are. So try and understand where they're already gathering, what their needs are, what their time constraints are, and designing programs around them. But we didn't just work with women, and I think that's what we've all learned through gender programs. We worked with gatekeepers in the community. So if parents were stopping their young girls going to school, then we try and understand why, and we work with groups of parents to try and change those dynamics. We worked with business mentors to try and expose young women to the fact that you can work in this industry. So we put some young women through plumbing vocational courses and electrical courses. So just trying to shake things up a bit and give them a different perspective on life. And we worked with taboo subjects. So we talked with young men and talked about menstruation and tried to demystify that and talk about feminine hygiene and try and kind of bring it out into the open a bit. So it was really a program that tried to understand those vulnerabilities specifically and work in a very targeted way with all of the community at all levels, not just women.
Thank you. I've always thought that all of these types of approaches could be translated into projects that were, you know, climate adaptation and mitigation projects on the tin. Don't see why not, do you?
Exactly, it makes sense, and I think some of the other panelists have already told you the economic outcomes of women-led design processes and just putting women at the center of some of this. I don't understand why we don't do it. I think some people get frightened of the terms and they think they need to be an expert. So some of this is really, the toolkits are there to try and make sense of that and demystify it for people, so well done to the authors.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to have a pre-recorded intervention from my colleague Alexandra Vasquez in Ecuador. So technical team, could you go ahead and play that, please? Thank you.
We hear often that gender mainstreaming in climate projects is required by donors or highlighted as important, but people who need to design and implement the project are either perplexed as to why it really matters, or they want to do it but don't know how to put it in practice. Is that your experience in Ecuador or in the Andean countries or in Latin America? That people don't think gender matters or don't know how to do it?
Al momento, en América Latina se han desarrollado varios procesos de fortalecimiento de capacidades de manera regional y también en cada país, sobre lo que se debe hacer para responder a los compromisos internacionales respecto a la incorporación del enfoque de género. Por supuesto que estos procesos son todavía insuficientes, pero hay muy buenas pistas en capacitaciones, publicaciones y metodologías que están al alcance de los equipos técnicos, de tomadores y tomadoras de decisiones de los diferentes países. Es así que en los procesos de las contribuciones nacionales determinadas, los planes nacionales de adaptación al cambio climático o planes de acción de género y cambio climático, se incorpora cada vez más metodologías, indicadores y elementos que concretan la incorporación del enfoque de género en la acción climática.
How do you get people to care about gender integration and show them it matters?
Primero, es fundamental la comprensión del fenómeno climático, su complejidad y la relación con los aspectos sociales, económicos y ambientales, y en ese contexto entender cómo los impactos del cambio climático son mayores para personas que viven desventajas y desigualdades. En ese marco, es fundamental abordar el tema de desigualdades de género y su traducción en mayor vulnerabilidad de mujeres y niñas de acuerdo a sus contextos, pero también es importante reconocer sus aportes para la generación de respuestas frente al cambio climático, así como para la construcción de resiliencia. Luego, es importante contar con datos estadísticos sobre las desigualdades, vulnerabilidades e impactos diferenciados del cambio climático en diferentes ámbitos, entre ellos la participación de mujeres y jóvenes en espacios de toma de decisiones. Compartir buenas prácticas y mostrar cómo se puede aportar a la igualdad de género y no incrementar las desigualdades desde la acción climática. Con estas evidencias se requiere además garantizar la voluntad de los decisores de política y desarrollar capacidades con funcionarios y funcionarias relacionados con la gestión climática en los diferentes sectores de interés del cambio climático.
What has been your experience with building people's capacity to operationalize gender mainstreaming in their project and really follow it through?
En Ecuador se han desarrollado capacidades para la integración del enfoque de género en la gestión del cambio climático, utilizando listas de chequeo como herramientas de verificación, pero mucho más que eso. Se ha presentado información, herramientas, conceptos y propiciado la aplicación de los aprendizajes en espacios de trabajo de las personas participantes. La capacitación desarrollada con el Ministerio de Ambiente, Agua y Transición Ecológica en el año 2019 permitió recuperar lecciones aprendidas y construir una caja de herramientas sobre género y cambio climático. Esta caja está siendo aplicada en diferentes contextos y con diferentes públicos. Por ejemplo, se ha trabajado con funcionarios y funcionarias relacionados con los sectores de la adaptación al cambio climático, priorizados en la estrategia nacional. Como resultados relevantes sobre esta aplicación, se cuenta con propuestas de aplicación de la transversalización del enfoque de género en iniciativas relacionadas a la adaptación del cambio climático. La caja de herramientas también está siendo aplicada en acciones concretas para la transversalización del enfoque de género en proyectos específicos, como es el caso del proyecto Adaptación a los impactos del cambio climático en recursos hídricos, donde se están desarrollando medidas de adaptación sensibles al género con acciones sensibles y responsivas de género. Adicionalmente, esta caja de herramientas ha servido para orientar otros procesos regionales de fortalecimiento de capacidades, por ejemplo, el curso Integración del enfoque de género en la gestión del cambio climático, liderado por el Ministerio de Ambiente de Chile e implementado a nivel regional. Como resultados de este curso, también se dispone de propuestas específicas de transversalización, las mismas que tendrán un proceso de seguimiento para identificar sus impactos.
With many thanks to Alexandra for that intervention. The reason we wanted to include her is because she has worked really hard, as she described in that video clip, to do awareness raising, training and peer-to-peer knowledge exchange with professionals within Ecuador to facilitate gender mainstreaming and its application. And so it helps to describe, if not the precise details of the care project in here, which is a different project that's described. She's working sort of at the national context to lay the groundwork for that. And it also provides me with a segue to our next speaker, Robbie Redder, because Alexandra was actually the original architect of a rather wonderful interactive training exercise that CDKN ended up developing. She trialled it first in Ecuador as part of that capacity building work that she just described. And it's an interactive role play game to introduce people to the way that climate hazards and climate risks impact different people in society and how they have different capacities to respond and how they can work better with each other. And it's called the Climate and Society game, and it's got very colourful cards with different characters on them who have got different sexes, sexual orientation, age, ethnicity, religion, ability or disability. And it's a way in a training or workshop setting of sort of unpacking some of these intersectional issues and appealing to people's hearts as well as to people's minds to really engage them and, you know, make them want to talk more about these issues and how they apply to climate projects. And this exercise, which Alexandra developed and then we expanded for the CDKN team across Latin America, Africa and Asia, it's set in fictional scenarios where there may be flood risks or extreme heat or drought risks, which are actually rather true to life, even though they are couched as being fictional in the game. Robbie Redder, your lead for CDKN Ethiopia, and you've been very active with your team in trying to both use an Ethiopian version of this game and many other approaches and methodologies to get gender from being a concept on paper and actually into implementation in Ethiopia. So let's start with the upstream. How did you go about scoping the need? We knew as CDKN that we wanted to do something on gender. How did you go about doing a kind of feasibility assessment of what had to be done?
Okay, thanks, Mairi. So to start off, Ethiopia has an ambitious climate change strategy. It came out in 2011. But like most climate strategies, it was too technical, and there was no human element or did not talk about society. You know, it's just numbers around greenhouse gas reduction and so on. In 2014, a national climate change was set up in Ethiopia, and the responsibility of that National Climate Change Fund was to write proposals and also develop bankable proposals and also support community and other initiatives to get funding. So it was at that point that the discussion started around, you know, let's start talking about vulnerable groups. Let's start talking about people and how they're affected by climate change. So that was sort of a conversation starter. Around 2018, when the new phase of CDKN came about, and that program had a lot of emphasis on gender, we were also interested in scoping and seeing what the needs are in Ethiopia. And already at that time, in Ethiopia also, the policy documents like the National Adaptation Plan and other policy-orientated documents had a lot of, had some gender consideration in them. So there was a lot of interest from the Ethiopian government as well. So when we started the scoping work, we said we need to get a good expert with a climate change expert with gender expertise or vice versa. We looked for such an expert, there was none. So we said maybe if we brought in a climate change expert and a gender expert with an understanding of the context and so on, maybe they can supplement, complement each other and you know, do a good scoping report with the needs and so on. They did a good scoping piece, but not only did they do that, they also linked us to a network of professionals, government, civil servants who were responsible for mainstreaming of climate change, mainstreaming of gender. And in the discussions we had, they all had to a certain extent mainstreaming fatigue because they're quite isolated from the system and they're required to mainstream. Or they don't have tools, they don't have anything. And they felt maybe as a community of practitioners, they would do better. So there was interest when we discussed the scoping report to come together and do this. And, as a coherent group, of course, capacity building as usual and awareness were priorities, but maybe I'll talk about it later.
Okay, great. Yes, awareness raising and capacity building. Indeed, that was my next question, Robbie. What were the mechanics of it? How did you go about it?
I mean, the scoping work was not generic in how, sometimes you get something generic saying, we need awareness, we need capacity building. This, we tried to unpack what that was during the scoping stage. A lot of the interest was to learn from the experience of others, both outside of their network or within the country, from a ministry that's done a lot of work on gender-sensitive budgeting, for instance, or from, how is Kenya doing this, and, that sort of thing. After meeting for a few times, then we, COVID came about. So we had to start doing things remotely. And as part of that, said maybe doing a resource pack that responded to some of these needs would be the best way to go about this. So we started compiling cases. We also started doing a resource pack. On technical issues, they said they wanted to know more about, and Mairi was instrumental. She's also CDKN, so she was part of that process. And like I said, it wasn't just things that were brought, but also experience from within them. So sort of showcasing those and developing that into a resource pack. Mairi already talked about the gender climate nexus games. And in general, with these games, you tend to see them being used by civil society organizations or committee groups and so on. But there was a lot of interest from government civil servants to actually play them and use them. So yeah, this were more or less how we approached it.
Yeah, great. And maybe a final question. Any sort of remarkable examples that you have from different sectors of the economy in Ethiopia about how gender has been mainstreamed in climate adaptation and or mitigation?
I can talk about a flagship water access project in Ethiopia, GCF funded. That's directly, that was developed by the direct access entity, the National Climate Change Fund. So where we're at now is where we're designing better projects because there's better, there's better knowledge, better systems, and so on and so forth. In this proposal, the focus is in water access in rural communities that are climate vulnerable and food insecure. And water management, water access is always engendered and women go far to fetch water, but have very relatively little say in the management of that fetched water. So what this project is trying to do is create at the community, at the beneficiary level, ensure that women are part of it. So that sort of management responsibility. And in terms of designing solutions, it also includes women in it, in the design of wash facilities or in maintenance as well, because maintenance is another aspect that women in water schemes are not part of in general. So that's a good example, I hope. But one thing that's coming up is, you know, while projects are designed well, there's very little follow-up. Climate change projects, in the end, are evaluated for their climate outcomes and not for gender outcomes, is what I've noticed in a way, because they're climate change, at least in Ethiopia. So there needs to be a bit more capacity built around, you know, that, I think.
Thank you, Robbie. It's now time for questions and answers from the audience, both online audience as well as in person in the room. So please think of your questions. And if you're in the room and you would like to pose one, please come up to one of the microphones to ask. That would be brilliant. While you're ruminating on your questions, I think that Robbie has just raised a really interesting issue for Tara about saying that climate finance projects don't have enough follow-through on gender outcomes. What do you think, Tara? And what does the guide have to say about it?
Absolutely. One of the difficulties that we were coming across with this guide in general, because we were focused on the major multilateral climate funds, the Adaptation Fund, the CIFs, the GEF, and the GCF, is that particularly with the GCF and the Adaptation Fund and the CIFs, many of these projects are newer. And the GCF has just started implementation within the past few years. So really understanding with these years-long projects what the final outcomes are is something that we don't quite know yet. And thus far, the projects that have been more completed tend to not have been designed under the more rigorous requirements around gender that have emerged within recent years. And so we're not seeing that reporting and that tracking on gender equality. Newer templates have been put into place, but it's yet to see how well those can help to influence a more robust consideration throughout the entire project. One of the recommendations that was focused on collecting the right data from the start was really also about understanding that if you don't have some baseline data to really measure progress and to use as a platform for adaptive management throughout the course of the project, what you're going to end up with is some very shallow gender reporting because it's the only data that there is. And it's going to be based often on just participation in the various activities of the project and some basic sex disaggregated data around that, rather than really understanding the full context of gender dynamics and how those are being influenced by the project.
Tete, did you want to add to that at all?
Well, I think it's really, really important that it's not just about bringing more women to the table, but actually listening to what women would have to say. You know, what kind of projects, what kind of initiatives would really benefit them, not just in the short term, not just in the project cycle, but beyond that. No, so I think that's the challenge that we're always facing, because all of these are so short-term or medium-term at best. But what we need are, you know, durable solutions that last beyond the project cycle.
Said. Do we have any questions? Yes, please come up to the microphone to say your question. Thanks. And if you would identify yourself by name and your organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'm Fabiana Mena from Argentina, from Gran Chaco Foundation. Well, congratulations to all. We are working in the Gran Chaco region, which is not only in Argentina, but also Paraguay and Bolivia, in a regional initiative to reinforce women capacity to adaptation and mitigation to climate change. So I'm very pleased and interested in your experience. Congratulations for the guide, because I'm sure we are going to use a lot, because we are always looking for new materials, not only about methodology, but about specific cases, no? Because the implementation, the action is the problem. In this case, well, I think it could be an opportunity to contact Alexandra and to share experience in Latin America and to, well, and with the network, no? The CDKN network, and specifically to the experience that you are exposed today. I was wondering, how was, if you could implement some kind of exchanges like South-South cooperation within the different, if you had the opportunity. And the other one is, how was the impact of this specific project? The question is to whoever wants to answer, to impact in public policy, no? Not only at the project level, but to in a replicably, about the opportunity to reply the experience and get a more wide impact at national level. I'm very, because all of your experience are very interesting, but many times the problem is how to scale up this experience to achieve a national impact. Thank you.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Thanks for your question. On the second part of your question, I don't know the exact details, but it's just on the case study that's in the book. They did come up with codes of conduct for women and young girls at school, and that was escalated to national policies. So they have school charters and do no harm pledges, and those were implemented with the government of Nigeria's National Commission for Mass Literacy. So as well as working in the community and working with individuals, they were also trying to tackle policy issues and try and change institutions. So definitely in the Engine project, that was an attempt. And on your peer exchange, I'm not sure what was happening on the Africa side. There's lots of various INGOs that do peer exchange on climate and gender. Some of them are stronger than others, but I'm sure, especially with the Latin America examples here, it would be great to connect with your project and to bring some of those people together. So thank you for the idea.
Would any other panelists like to respond? It was an open question, I think. Yeah, go ahead, Martin.
If the mic is open. On the cook stoves example from Tanzania, for example, that really started quite locally in the lake zone of Tanzania, so that's just 6 regions, and still a significant amount of people, 12 million people live there. It started actually smaller, but therefore it spread and it basically was replicated, and it became a national program. So basically, while it started with cook stoves producers in certain parts of the lake zone around Lake Victoria, it spread it south coast, etc. So it's a national program now. It's working also closely with the government. It's responding to government priorities. Now, to say that there's a replication effect of the same approaches into other sectors and really an adoption of those approaches at the government level, no, I would not say so. I will be honest about that. And it's challenging. We saw that also in the Cambodia project. There, actually, in the Cambodia project, my understanding is from the colleagues, also there, government was closely involved in the capacity building and training. Now, what you generally see within governments, officials change. So the one-off capacity building will never work. It needs to be a continuous effort. It's not only training, it's coaching, and to kind of, again, internalize all those things institutionally at a government level is very challenging, but efforts are being done, yeah.
Maybe Cambodia could learn from Ethiopia's gender community of practice. Yes. There's another peer exchange.
Yeah, in this case, also in what I'm describing, it's more policies being there, but that's not translating to action, so it's the other way too.
Challenges both ways.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we have another question. Would you mind coming up to the microphone? Just saying your name and organisation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Kirsty Smith from CBM Global Disability Inclusion. Fantastically well done on these 2 really great additions. I'm interested to know a little bit more about the specificity, because women are not a homogenous group. We know that the age of the woman will greatly determine the extent to which she is marginalised. We know that her location And it's particularly true for women with disabilities. They are very, very much more marginalised than women without. We're being encouraged by the UK government and other key stakeholders and funders to think less vertically. So instead of us talking about disability inclusion, we're being encouraged to talk about equity and inclusion much more broadly. And while I recognise that we don't want to lose the very specific things that come with disability inclusion or age or gender, I'm interested to know to what extent these guides might dovetail or align with other similar guides, because we find our local partners overwhelmed with the need to use this MEL tool for this and this approach for this, and in the end they can't actually do any of them because they're being asked to do so many different things. So was there any consideration given to that intersectionality?
Go ahead, Tara.
Thank you so much for that question. One of the things that this guide does is it has an inset really talking about different types of gender expertise. And whether that's held by individuals that are working at this intersection of gender and climate change, which we did hear mentioned are sometimes difficult to find, it's a growing field, as well as the expertise that's held by local organizations and grassroots organizations. And one of the foundational pieces of that expertise is an intersectional understanding. And I think that comes in many ways, especially when you are consulting the people on the ground and ensuring that true listening to voices and understanding those needs in order to shape priorities. And so I think this comes in many ways. And I also want to respond to this idea of being overwhelmed by all of these different tools and different methodologies. And I think that's why it's also really important that we are working in partnership and leveraging different institutions and expertise and data that they have. So looking at how local partners can be helping in implementation and helping in design by also working with national, regional, and international partners as well, because I only think that it's in bringing together all of this expertise that we are going to really have the full picture that is needed for the types of equity and inclusion that are absolutely necessary for effective climate action.
I'll say something very short about what's in this manual, and then we're going to come to Santiago because our time is almost out. This manual does talk about the ODI Action Aid tool, which is set up for people to guide people to do intersectional assessments in communities when they're designing climate projects. There's quite a bit about that in a text box and references. And the engine case study, which Lizzie described, that really there's tons of detail. We couldn't present it all today, but on how the indicators and the whole MEL system were designed to be extremely intersectional in their outlook. So I hope you'll find it useful, and please, for everyone, do help yourself to publications at the end if you'd like a hard copy. Santiago, it's over to you. You are the Director for Climate Resilient Food Systems at IDRC. And so I think you're going to give us some closing remarks.
And I'm not going to summarize everything because it will be another hour. The objectives actually for this event were that the audience will be intrigued and inspired and will apply the guidelines as you go home. I don't know if you are intrigued, but I'm sure you are inspired, and I'm sure that you are going to jump and use the guides. I tried to do a small word cloud, and some of the common elements that I have been listening to all of you is gender experts, because gender is also a science and we need the best brains to bring that science, because if not, we will not have the results that we are looking for. But we also need gender capacity across everybody that is involved in everything that we do, because if not, it will not bring the transformation that we need. The other thing was understanding. I think all of you have used the word understanding, listening. And I want to make a point there, because understanding doesn't mean always agreeing. We need to understand, we need to listen, we need to have conversations, but we are challenging social structures to make a major transformation. So understanding sometimes will be challenged those that will listen. The other thing was involving power holders. This is, we're saying it's not about women, even when we have only 13%, understanding that I am doing that analysis based on what we are wearing, not what is our gender definition. We need to involve the power holders. They need to be also part of the conversation, and because they are the ones that also want to change in the transformation. We are going to have tools, but tools are going to be that need to be addressed to the different needs. We cannot use the same tools. Not everybody experience the planet in the same way. And it's your responsibility to take these tools and apply them as they are needed to be applied. I think, and I'm from IDRC, for the International Development Research Center, we took a decision some time ago, is that we are not funding any gender-blind project. Principal, because it's not good research. If it's blinder, it's the gender blind. We will not be funding a non-gravity forces bridge builder because doesn't believe in gravity. It will say, no, gender is the same. It is there and needs to be addressed. And the other thing is that we need both at the same time. We need to integrate the transversal aspect of gender in our interventions, whatever it is, finance, engineering, capacity building, but we also need gender-specific and transformative initiatives that are the flagships of the interventions that we do, or we will not get either gender transformation and gender equality or climate action at the ambition that we require in the next decade. That's what I was listening from you. I hope that I took everything that you wanted. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Goodbye.